On Christmas Day, 1066, a bastard duke from Normandy walked into Westminster Abbey as a conqueror and emerged as a king. William the Conqueror's coronation was so chaotic that his Norman guards, hearing the Anglo-Saxon crowd cheering, thought a riot had broken out and began setting fire to nearby buildings. As smoke poured into the abbey and panic spread through the congregation, William stood trembling before the altar, receiving a crown that would establish a dynasty lasting nearly 1,000 years. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. William had no legitimate claim to the English throne. He was an illegitimate son who had seized power through one of the most audacious military gambles in history. And his descendants would go on to rule not just England, but eventually an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. The crown that was placed on his head that smoky Christmas morning would pass through the hands of saints and sinners, geniuses and madmen, reformers and tyrants, creating a story so filled with murder, intrigue, love, betrayal, and power that it reads like the most outrageous soap opera ever conceived. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the dramatic truths behind history's greatest stories. I'm your host, and I'm about to take you on a journey through nearly a millennium of British royal history. A tale that begins with a Norman warlord gambling everything on a single battle, and continues to a modern constitutional monarchy that somehow survived 2 world wars, the collapse of an empire, and scandals that would have destroyed any ordinary institution. This is the complete story of the British crown, from conquest to commonwealth, and it's more incredible than any fiction writer could imagine. William's conquest of England wasn't just a change of rulers. It was a complete transformation of English society. The Norman conquest represents one of the most thorough cultural revolutions in European history, and it happened with shocking speed. Within a generation, the entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy had been replaced with Norman nobles. English became a peasant language while French dominated the court, and even the architecture changed as massive Norman castles and cathedrals rose across the landscape. But William faced a problem that would plague his successors for centuries. How do you rule a conquered people who outnumber you 50-1 and speak a different language? His solution was characteristically brutal and effective. The harrying of the North in 1069-70 saw William's armies systematically destroy everything between York and Durham, creating a wasteland that took generations to recover. It was genocide by any modern definition, but it achieved William's goal of crushing English resistance. When William died in 1087, he had created something unprecedented, a unified English kingdom under centralized Norman control, with detailed records of every village and farm in the country recorded in the Domesday Book. But his death also created the first of many succession crises that would define royal history. William left England to his second son, William Rufus, while his eldest son, Robert, inherited Normandy. This division set up a pattern that would repeat throughout medieval history. English kings constantly fighting to maintain control of their French territories while dealing with rebellions at home. William Rufus was everything his father wasn't: flamboyant, possibly homosexual, and openly contemptuous of the church. He died mysteriously in 1100 while hunting in the New Forest. Officially an accident, but suspiciously convenient for his younger brother Henry, who happened to be in the same hunting party and managed to reach Winchester and seize the royal treasury with remarkable speed. Henry I's reign established another recurring theme in royal history: the importance of producing legitimate male heirs. Despite having at least 20 illegitimate children, Henry's only legitimate son died in the White Ship disaster of 1120, one of medieval England's greatest tragedies. The ship carrying the cream of Anglo-Norman nobility sank in the English Channel, and with it died Henry's dynastic plans. Henry's decision to name his daughter Matilda as his heir sparked England's first great civil war. Medieval Europe wasn't ready for a female ruler, and when Henry died in 1135, his nephew Stephen seized the throne, plunging the country into nearly 20 years of warfare known as the anarchy. It was during this period that the expression, "when Christ and his saints slept," was coined to describe the lawlessness and suffering that engulfed England. The Civil War only ended when Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, inherited not just his mother's claim to England, but also vast territories in France through his father, and his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. When Stephen died in 1154, young Henry became king of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry II was perhaps the most capable ruler in English history, a man of boundless energy who could ride from one end of his empire to the other, dispense justice, lead armies, and still find time to conduct one of medieval Europe's most scandalous love affairs. His relationship with Eleanor of Aquitaine was a passionate marriage between two of the most powerful people in Europe, but it was also a political alliance that created the Angevin Empire. But Henry's greatest achievement was also his greatest tragedy. His efforts to control the church led to his conflict with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had once been his closest friend. Their friendship turned to bitter enmity when Becket refused to allow royal control over church courts. Henry's frustrated outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" led to Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170. The murder of Thomas Becket shocked medieval Europe and forced Henry to do public penance. But it also demonstrated the fundamental tension between royal power and church authority that would shape English history for centuries. More immediately, it marked the beginning of Henry's family troubles, as his wife and sons began plotting against him. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most remarkable women of the medieval period, a patron of troubadours and courtly love who had been Queen of France before becoming Queen of England. But she was also fiercely independent and refused to accept the subordinate role expected of medieval wives. When she discovered Henry's affair with Rosamund Clifford, she began encouraging their sons to rebel against their father. The result was a series of family wars that would make a modern therapist rich. Henry's sons, young Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, spent most of the 1170s and 1180s fighting their father and each other for control of various parts of the Angevin Empire. Eleanor was imprisoned for 15 years for her role in these rebellions, while Henry aged rapidly under the stress of fighting his own family. When Henry died in 1189, defeated and abandoned by all his sons, he was succeeded by Richard I, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. Richard's reign perfectly illustrates the gap between legend and reality in royal history. The crusading king beloved of English folklore actually spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign in England and spoke French as his native language. Richard was a military genius and one of the greatest knights of his age, but he was also financially irresponsible and completely uninterested in governance. He bankrupted England to fund his crusade, then had to ransom himself from the Holy Roman Emperor for a sum equivalent to twice the kingdom's annual income. When he died childless in 1199, fighting a petty war in France, he left the throne to his brother John, and thereby doomed the Angevin Empire. King John, the villain of the Robin Hood legends, was actually a more competent administrator than his brother Richard, but he faced impossible challenges. He lost most of the French territories to Philip Augustus of France, earning the nickname John Lackland. His efforts to raise money to win them back led to his conflict with the barons that culminated in Magna Carta. The signing of Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215 is often portrayed as the foundation of English liberty, but the reality was more complicated. John signed the document because he had no choice. He was facing a baronial rebellion and possible deposition. He immediately appealed to the Pope to declare the charter invalid, and civil war resumed within months. John's death in 1216 left the throne to his 9-year-old son, Henry III, and England under the regency of William Marshal, perhaps the greatest knight of the age. The minority of Henry III established another precedent in English royal history: the development of institutions strong enough to function even when the king was incapable of ruling personally. Henry III's long reign saw the development of Parliament as an institution and the gradual evolution of England from a conquered territory into a unified nation. But Henry's obsession with his saintly predecessor, Edward the Confessor, and his expensive building projects, including the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, created financial problems that would plague the monarchy for generations. The real drama of the 13th century came with Henry's son, Edward IV, known as Longshanks, for his unusual height, and Hammer of the Scots, for his military campaigns. Edward was perhaps the most formidable warrior king in English history, a man who conquered Wales, nearly conquered Scotland, and created the legal and administrative systems that would govern England for centuries. But Edward's reign also demonstrated the limitations of medieval monarchy. Despite his military genius, he couldn't hold Scotland permanently, and his son Edward II proved that royal ability wasn't hereditary. Edward II was everything his father wasn't: weak, incompetent, and more interested in his male favorites than in governing. His relationship with Piers Gaveston scandalized the nobility and led to Gaveston's murder by the barons. Edward's subsequent favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, was even more unpopular and corrupt. The reign of Edward II ended in one of the most dramatic episodes in royal history. His queen, Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, began an affair with Roger Mortimer and invaded England to overthrow her husband. Edward II was deposed and imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, where he was murdered in 1397 in a manner so gruesome that medieval chroniclers could barely bring themselves to describe it. The 14-year-old Edward III inherited a kingdom in chaos, but his reign would see England emerge as a major European power. Edward's claim to the French throne through his mother Isabella sparked the 100 Years' War, the longest conflict in European history. His victories at Crécy and Poitiers established England as a military power and made him one of the most famous kings in Europe. But Edward III's reign also saw the arrival of the Black Death in 1348, which killed perhaps 1/3 of England's population. The plague transformed English society, creating labor shortages that led to higher wages for peasants, and ultimately to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Edward III's death in 1377 brought another child king to the throne, as his 10-year-old grandson Richard II inherited the crown. Richard's reign would end with the first successful deposition of an English king since the Norman conquest, establishing a precedent that would haunt the monarchy for centuries. Richard II was highly intelligent and cultured, a patron of Geoffrey Chaucer and a devotee of courtly magnificence. But he was also paranoid and increasingly tyrannical, believing in the absolute power of kingship at a time when the nobility expected consultation and consent. The crisis came when Richard's uncle John of Gaunt died in 1399, and Richard seized the vast Lancastrian estates instead of allowing Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, to inherit. This violation of property rights united the nobility against Richard, and when Bolingbroke invaded England, Richard's support collapsed completely. Henry IV's usurpation of the throne as Henry IV created a new problem for English royalty: how to rule legitimately when everyone knows you're a usurper. Henry spent his entire reign fighting rebellions, including a major uprising led by the Percy family of Northumberland and the Welsh revolt of Owain Glyndwr. The usurpation also established the House of Lancaster's claim to the throne, setting up the dynastic conflict that would eventually explode into the Wars of the Roses. But first came Henry V, the hero of Agincourt and the last great warrior king of medieval England. Henry V's reign was brief but glorious. His victory at Agincourt in 1415, where a small English army defeated a much larger French force, became one of the defining moments of English national identity. Henry's conquest of northern France and his marriage to Catherine of Valois made him heir to the French throne and created the prospect of a unified Anglo-French monarchy. But Henry's early death in 1422 at age 35 destroyed these dreams and left the throne to his infant son, Henry VI. The minority of Henry VI, combined with his eventual mental illness, created the power vacuum that led to the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI was pious and scholarly, but completely unsuited to medieval kingship. His periodic bouts of mental illness, probably inherited from his French grandfather Charles VI, made effective government impossible. When Henry suffered his first mental breakdown in 1453, his cousin Richard of York was appointed protector, beginning the conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. The Wars of the Roses weren't a single conflict, but a series of civil wars spanning 30 years, from 1455 to 1485. The wars saw the throne change hands multiple times, with periods of Yorkist rule under Edward IV and Richard III interrupted by Lancastrian restorations. Edward the Maestlin was a giant of a man, over 6 feet tall in an age when most people were much shorter, and one of the ablest kings of the 15th century. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a minor noble family, scandalized the court but produced two sons who seemed to secure the Yorkist succession. But Edward's early death in 1483 at age 40 created another minority, and his brother Richard of Gloucester seized power as Richard III. The fate of Edward's sons, the princes in the Tower, remains one of history's greatest mysteries. They disappeared from the Tower of London shortly after Richard's usurpation and were almost certainly murdered, though whether by Richard's orders or someone else's remains hotly debated. Richard III's reign lasted only 2 years before he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Defeated by Henry Tudor, a Welsh nobleman with a tenuous claim to the throne through his mother's descent from John of Gaunt. Henry VII's victory established the Tudor dynasty and ended the Wars of the Roses, but it also brought a new kind of monarchy to England. The Tudors represented a break with the medieval past. Henry VII was a Renaissance prince who understood that royal power depended as much on propaganda and financial management as on military prowess. He rebuilt the royal finances, established a professional bureaucracy, and created the image of Tudor magnificence that would reach its peak under his son. Henry VIII began his reign as the Golden Prince of Renaissance Europe, tall, handsome, athletic, and scholarly. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon seemed to promise a new golden age for England, but Henry's obsession with producing a male heir would transform him into one of history's most notorious monarchs and fundamentally change the nature of English kingship. Henry's great matter, his attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, began as a personal issue but became a constitutional revolution. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolved the monasteries, seizing their vast wealth for the crown. The English Reformation wasn't just a religious change. It was a political and social revolution that touched every aspect of English life. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed perhaps 1/3 of England's land, creating a new class of Protestant landowners with a vested interest in maintaining the religious settlement. But Henry's 6 marriages revealed the personal cost of absolute power. His execution of Anne Boleyn on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason shocked Europe and demonstrated that not even queens were safe from Henry's tyranny. The pattern repeated with Catherine Howard, while Catherine Parr, his 6th wife, probably saved her own life only by submitting completely to Henry's will. Henry's death in 1547 left the throne to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, whose reign saw the Protestant Reformation reach its most radical phase under the guidance of Edward Seymour and John Dudley. But Edward's early death at age 15 created a succession crisis that nearly destroyed the Tudor dynasty. Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign in 1553 was one of the most tragic episodes in royal history. The granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary, Jane was proclaimed queen by John Dudley in an attempt to maintain Protestant rule. But she was no match for the popular support enjoyed by Henry's daughter Mary, who successfully claimed the throne and had Jane executed for treason. Mary's attempt to restore Catholicism earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, as she burned nearly 300 Protestant heretics at the stake. But Mary's persecution of Protestants was actually less severe than the persecution of Catholics under her predecessors, and her real failure was her inability to produce an heir with her Spanish husband, Philip II. Mary's death in 1558 brought her half-sister Elizabeth to the throne, beginning what many consider the greatest reign in English history. Elizabeth I inherited a kingdom divided by religious conflict, threatened by foreign invasion, and economically struggling. She transformed it into a major European power that defeated the Spanish Armada and began the English colonization of North America. Elizabeth's 45-year reign established many of the myths and traditions still associated with the British monarchy. Her carefully crafted image as the Virgin Queen, married to England, created a new model of female rulership that combined political pragmatism with powerful symbolism. But Elizabeth's greatest achievement was also her greatest failure. She died childless, ending the Tudor dynasty and leaving the throne to James VI of Scotland, the son of her executed cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. The accession of James I in 1603 united the English and Scottish crowns for the first time since the Roman period, but it also brought new challenges. James believed in the divine right of kings and had little patience for English parliamentary traditions. His insistence that kings were accountable only to God created tensions that would eventually explode under his son. Charles V inherited his father's belief in absolute monarchy but lacked his political skills. Charles's attempts to rule without parliament, his religious policies, and his arbitrary taxation led to civil war in 1642. The English Civil War wasn't just a political conflict, it was a constitutional revolution that challenged the fundamental basis of royal authority. The execution of Charles the Year on January 30th, 1649, sent shockwaves throughout Europe. For the first time since antiquity, a European people had formally tried and executed their king for treason against his own subjects. The Commonwealth period under Oliver Cromwell proved that England could function without a monarch, but it also demonstrated the practical difficulties of republican government in a monarchical age. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 seemed to mark a return to traditional monarchy, but the Civil War had permanently changed the relationship between crown and parliament. Charles II was witty, intelligent, and politically astute enough to avoid his father's fate, but his secret Catholicism and his lack of legitimate heirs created new succession problems. James II's brief reign from 1685 to 1688 proved that the lessons of the Civil War hadn't been learned by all the Stuarts. James's open Catholicism and his attempts to pack Parliament with Catholic supporters alarmed Protestant England. But the real crisis came with the birth of James's son in 1688, which promised a Catholic dynasty. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was remarkable for what didn't happen. A foreign invasion succeeded without significant fighting, a king was deposed without bloodshed, and a new constitutional settlement was established without civil war. William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's Protestant daughter, accepted the throne on Parliament's terms, marking the definitive establishment of constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights of 1689 formally limited royal power and established parliamentary supremacy, but it did so while maintaining the institution of monarchy. This compromise between royal tradition and parliamentary government would become the foundation of the modern British political system. The death of Queen Anne in 1714 ended the Stuart dynasty and brought the House of Hanover to the throne. George I's accession marked another turning point in royal history. The importation of a German dynasty that couldn't speak English and had little interest in British politics. The early Hanoverian kings were saved from irrelevance by their political incompetence, which forced them to rely on their ministers and inadvertently strengthened constitutional government. Robert Walpole became Britain's first prime minister during George III's reign, establishing the principle that the monarch should reign but not rule. George III's long reign from 1760 to 1820 saw Britain survive the loss of the American colonies, defeat Napoleon, and begin the Industrial Revolution. But George's periodic bouts of mental illness, probably caused by porphyria, created a new kind of constitutional crisis and led to the establishment of the Regency under his son, the future George IV. The Regency period, dominated by the colorful personality of the Prince Regent, saw British culture reach new heights of sophistication, while the monarchy itself sank to new depths of unpopularity. George IV's scandalous private life, his extravagant spending, and his treatment of his wife Caroline of Brunswick made the royal family a target of popular ridicule. The accession of Victoria in 1837 transformed the monarchy once again. The 18-year-old queen inherited a throne weakened by the excesses of her uncles, but her sense of duty, her happy marriage to Prince Albert, and her longevity gradually restored royal prestige. Victoria's reign of 63 years saw Britain become the world's dominant power, ruling an empire on which the sun never set. The Victorian age established the modern ceremonial role of the monarch, combining political neutrality with symbolic importance that would define the British crown for the next century. Prince Albert's early death in 1861 plunged Victoria into prolonged mourning that nearly destroyed the monarchy again. Her withdrawal from public life led to a Republican movement in the 1870s, but her golden and diamond jubilees restored popular enthusiasm for the crown. Edward VII's succession in 1901 brought a king who understood the importance of public relations and international diplomacy. His 9-year reign helped establish this special relationship with France and prepared Britain for the coming European War. George Fihie's reign saw the monarchy survive the greatest crisis in its history: World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the fall of the German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires. The decision to change the royal family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor in 1917 symbolized the monarchy's successful transformation from a European dynastic institution into a uniquely British one. The abdication crisis of 1936 brought the monarchy to the brink of disaster when Edward VIII chose to marry Wallis Simpson rather than remain king. The crisis was resolved by the accession of his brother George VI, a shy man with a speech impediment who became a symbol of British resistance during World War II. George VI's death in 1952 brought his 25-year-old daughter Elizabeth to the throne. Elizabeth II's 70-year reign has seen the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth, the emergence of a global media culture, and challenges to the monarchy that would have been unimaginable to her predecessors. The modern House of Windsor has had to adapt to a democratic age where deference can no longer be taken for granted. Diana, Princess of Wales's death in 1997 created the greatest crisis of Elizabeth II's reign, as public anger over the royal family's response threatened the monarchy's future. But the institution has survived by adapting, as it has throughout its history. The marriages of William and Catherine, and Harry and Meghan, have shown the monarchy's ability to renew itself while maintaining continuity with the past. Elizabeth II's death in 2022 and the accession of Charles III marked another turning point. The new king inherited not just a crown but nearly 1,000 years of tradition, precedent, and accumulated wisdom about the art of constitutional monarchy. Looking back over this vast sweep of history, what emerges is not just the story of individual monarchs, but the evolution of an institution that has survived by constantly adapting to changing circumstances. From William the Conqueror's brutal conquest to Elizabeth II's ceremonial constitutionalism, the British monarchy has reinvented itself dozens of times while maintaining an unbroken line of succession. The crown that caused panic when placed on William's head in that smoky abbey now rests securely on Charles III's head, backed by centuries of constitutional development and popular acceptance. The institution that began with Norman warlords has evolved into something unique in the modern world, a constitutional monarchy that combines democratic governance with historical continuity. The British monarchy's greatest achievement may be its survival. In an age when most European monarchies have disappeared, when traditional institutions are constantly challenged, and when change happens at an unprecedented pace, the 1,000-year-old institution of British kingship continues to command respect and loyalty. This survival hasn't been accidental or easy. It has required constant adaptation, the sacrifice of real power for symbolic authority, and the acceptance that the monarchy serves the nation rather than ruling it. The kings and queens who understood this, like Elizabeth I, Victoria, and Elizabeth II, are remembered as great monarchs. Those who didn't, like Richard II, Charles III, and Edward VIII, either lost their thrones or their lives. The story of the British monarchy is ultimately a story about the relationship between tradition and change, between the need for continuity and the necessity of adaptation. It's a story that began with conquest and violence, but evolved into something more subtle and sophisticated, a constitutional arrangement that provides stability and ceremony while allowing democratic government to function. As Charles III begins his reign, he inherits not just a crown, but the accumulated wisdom of nearly 40 monarchs, who faced challenges ranging from foreign invasion to civil war, from religious reformation to world wars, from imperial expansion to decolonization. Each crisis tested the institution's ability to adapt and survive, and each successful adaptation strengthened the monarchy for future challenges. The British crown has endured longer than any other institution in British history. It has outlasted the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church's temporal power, the feudal system, absolute monarchy, and the British Empire itself. In an age of rapid change and institutional fragility, this longevity is remarkable and perhaps more valuable than we often realize. That brings us to the end of our 1,000-year journey through British royal history here at Professor Archive. From that chaotic Christmas Day coronation in 1066 to the carefully choreographed ceremonies of today, we've witnessed one of the most remarkable institutional survival stories in human history. If this epic tale of power, politics, and adaptation has given you a new appreciation for the complexity of constitutional monarchy, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got many more deep dives into the institutions and individuals that have shaped our modern world. What do you think is the secret to the British monarchy's extraordinary longevity? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, in a world where change is constant, sometimes the most radical thing an institution can do is endure. Until next time, this is Professor Archive reminding you that the crown that began with conquest has evolved into something far more sophisticated, a symbol of continuity in an age of endless change.